Hey everyone, let's move on to some other areas that I want to talk about. I sort of jokingly thought about naming this channel. I've got a heck of a lot to say. Uh, as anyone that knows me knows, I said if there was an Olympic event for talking, I probably could win the gold. Uh, but there's just so much stuff that I've thought about in my life and through experience that I want to try and put out because I genuinely want to try to help other people. Maybe things I say won't help you, but I'm giving you a different perspective maybe on things. So we're going to talk about mental health, which is a very big topic right now, sort of becoming into the awareness of more people. I think I've got a very different perspective on this to what most people have heard. So if we take a traditional, so someone says I'm depressed. Let's take depression. We could take anxiety. We could take, So if you don't know this, so if you go to the field of psychology, psychiatry, their viewpoint is based around the DSM. It's a book called the DSM, and it's where, based on, they would say, science. I'm going to say to you that it's not hard, what we call hard science. It's really a soft science, because what they're doing is they're observing you. So a method in science or computing is we talk about a black box. Let's say we look at your computer and we say, well, I wonder how that computer works. So we're looking from the outside and we look how the computer behaves, and we can try and guess at how it actually works internally. But quite honestly, that is very ineffective. I don't think most people would figure out how, how CPUs work and transistors and things from looking at the behavior of a computer. So then people try to look internally at the brain and look at things like neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine. There's a whole bunch of these, and try and look at the brain as a sort of chemical computer, and say there are imbalances. But the thing is that we can't currently in science plug in your brain like we can in your car. When your car has a problem, you get those fault codes and you can take it and plug in a computer, and you can read those codes and say, oh, this is probably what's wrong. Really, it's a largely guesswork about things like neurotransmitters. We can't easily measure that and what's going on over time. I think in the future, as we move forward, people who have those kinds of neurotransmitter imbalances will be able to put an implant and monitor them and see what is happening. The problem is we're just not at a point with science yet where we know enough. So essentially, anybody that you go and get, SSRIs or so serotonin uptake inhibitors is a classic attempt to manipulate that, or also we can manipulate dopamine levels up or down. We can talk all about these things. Look, I've studied all these things, I can tell you, but I'm just going to cut to the chase that frankly we just don't know enough in science to accurately do that. So everybody that tries to do that, you're kind of a little guinea pig experiment there, and sometimes it helps people and sometimes it doesn't, or sometimes it helps for a bit and then it seems to stop working. Is that because it was a placebo effect? So the mind, as I've already said to you, the mind is very powerful. It's kind of laughable when you think about this. In Western medicine, they say, oh, that's just a placebo effect. Well, hang on, if the placebo effect's that powerful, shouldn't we be trying to use that as a medical technique? Think about that. So they're correct. The placebo effect, in a lot of people, is powerful because the mind-body connection is very powerful. So if we can use that for ourselves, then that maybe is better than taking pharmaceutical drugs, which now, I don't want to get into a long debate about this, but a lot of scientists and experts in the field have looked at the area of what we call pharmacology and studies, and frankly there's very little evidence despite what the media push, because there's so much money. This is one of the big, I talk about the power elites. So the big ones in the Western field are, the medical elites, pharmacology, huge money, then petrochemical, Wall Street, banking. Okay, these are the big ones that have a huge influence over your so-called political system. They're, if you like, the pulling the levers, the men behind the curtain, the puppeteers, because they provide all the money that allows these politicians to get elected, and they want something for the money they're giving them, dark money. So the pharma elite in this country, incredibly powerful, one of the biggest, most powerful lobby groups. They have a huge sway over media because they provide a lot of the advertising. They have a lot of influence there and what people are hearing about the effectiveness of drugs. But if you're actually capable of reading scientific studies and understanding scientific method, and you look at how these studies are done, the methodologies, people have written books about this, by the way. It's not just me saying this. You can look into it. Top scientists and medical people also. The science is very weak for most of these things. I don't want to turn this into I could at some point, we'll do that, go through why I'm saying the science is weak, but other people have already done this if you want to look into the books. Basically, it's because in science, and most people haven't studied it, that there's two things. There's what we call statistical significance, and this is using statistics. And this is mostly what medical science and pharmacology are using, because they have this black box. And what we really want in science, and hard sciences like physics that I studied, is you have to study what we call causality. So the very first thing that I was taught in college was that correlation is not confirmation. That is to say, just because something is statistically visible, like in these medical studies, doesn't mean that it's real, because a lot of times those are just statistical anomalies, and particularly how you do the study can produce. So essentially, you can make the study get the results you want, and if you're paying big money to do these studies, as the farmer is, guess what? They're mostly going to get the results they want. So what we really want as a hard science is the causality, and of course that's incredibly difficult to get in the human body. It's also dangerous. So for example, in the area of these the Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson mRNA gene therapies for COVID, that's why they had to have emergency authorization, because up till this point humans had never really been allowed to be injected with these technologies because of the threat of lawsuit to the pharmacology. They've got around that, is my argument here. I understand why, and I do agree these technologies are amazing, but their potential. But that, we talk about this, I have to be careful what I say, but this is a good example. So they are really taking the opportunity to solve the COVID problem because they want to get around that long testing phase where they would be open to lawsuits if things went wrong. You can't actually sue them if there's a problem if you've taken these. And I absolutely, up till now it doesn't look like there's too many problems, but we will find out down the road. I hope to God that there isn't, because these technologies are amazing. These viral vector mRNA, as I said in other videos, to solve a lot of any health problem that is related to manipulation of what we call epigenetic gene expression. So without going deep down on this now, this is just to illustrate my point. What you need to understand is that our understanding of the human body, and particularly the mind-body connection, is pretty poor in terms of science, and we can't just plug you in and say, this is why you have anxiety, this is why you have depression. I have studied everything. I've read hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers to deal with my own health problems when they started 10 plus years ago, and I will try and impart a lot of what I've discovered. That I think one of the most important things that most people, including most doctors, you got to realize that most doctors are not keeping up with the leading edge of science. they again have a book and they're going from their book. But if you look more at like the leading edge scientists in the medical field, they're aware of what I'm going to tell you, which is we know now that the body is way more complicated than we thought. First of all, say this mind-body connection, and yeah, another example of big discovery that you are going to be becoming more and more aware of is what we call the gut biome. I'm sure you've heard of the gut biome and why people take probiotics and this idea, but it's way more complicated than that. So most of your immune system is in your lower intestine, and this interacts with your mind through something called the vagus nerve. And so there is this powerful interaction, mind-body interaction between your stomach and what you perceive as your mind. So for example, we know that a lot of anxiety is rooted in disruption of the gut biome, depression, all these things. And I've shown this on myself and other people that I've helped. Then what I discovered thinking about this and observing myself is that for example, air pollution affects your gut biome and therefore affects levels of anxiety and depression. So if people are wondering why these disorders are going exponential through the roof, that most people seem to have these problems now, this is largely a function of pollution, air pollution and pollution of the water supply and food, and just therefore disruption of your gut biome, and also through poor diet. And we can talk all about this. How I eventually overcame and have to manage my condition was through understanding all of this. So, and then your environment stress. So stress disrupts your gut biome, which then will disrupt. Stress is the number one absolute worst thing. What is stress? So we will have a whole discussion of what stress is. I think this is not very well defined for most people. You could say everything is stress. That's not what I mean. It's specific types of stress that are particularly disrupting to your gut biome, and therefore can cascade through to affect your mood. And what I've also observed in people, myself, when I was going through a particularly bad phase that affected my mind with this chronic health, and then other people, is once you have these disruptions, then you are much more vulnerable to if you get stressed or overtired or you don't eat properly. So I have a model of this. Imagine standing on a stool. What you're trying to be in life is what I call balance. So what is balance? Balance is I'm on the stool, something bad happens, in your life. It's like something trying to push you off the stool. And when your health is, we could say, good or optimized, you're able to sway and kind of balance yourself again. But if you have problems in your mind, or imbalances in your mind, in your gut biome, in your health in general, you will fall off that stool, and then it's incredibly difficult for you to rebalance yourself. I talk about getting unbalanced and getting rebalanced. And this is, now, I said about how I'm not like a Buddhist or like other spiritualism, because this ties into this, you see. So I once had a therapist say to me, wow, Mark, you're doing amazing. Like, I've never seen anybody recover like to the state you have from your condition. And I'm like, well, I still feel terrible. I still can't think like I used to. I still can't function. This isn't good enough. And they're like, well, this is good as anybody can do. And I was like, well, I can't accept that. And he was basically, well, the only way you could do any better is to leave your family so you have no stress and go and sort of meditate every day. This was his next level solution. Now my point about that is that's kind of like, like the what you hear in a lot of spirituality. The aim is, we have to meditate and we have to be mindful and we have to center ourselves, all these words, talking the talk that I talk about. But it's not that isn't valuable, but in all reality, again, this is the balance thing. Yeah, so in other words, if you don't want to live the life that you want to lead, then you can go do those things. But the point is that we're trying to be balanced and healthy doing the things we want to do. So there's this trade-off that most of us go through where we stop the way we solve this problem, this equation, this balance, is that we start avoiding the things we know cause us to get unbalanced. So now we're restricting our life experience, you see. So say I have anxiety, now I don't want to be around people and I don't want to speak in public, and that limits the sorts of work I can do. And so it creates all these limitations. My health got so bad, for 10 years I literally had to just not try to speak to anyone, have any interaction, because I realized, I just couldn't deal with that. So this is a flip side of that. And this is also my problem with pharmacology, because it say it helps you, but the way it helps you is by changing your personality. So let's say I have bipolar, and I take a drug for that. Now I don't have bipolar, but am I really me anymore? If you take my analogy, if we're like a biological computer program, I've fundamentally changed who I am. So the assumption there is, well, you shouldn't have bipolar. That's a deep discussion, so we'll get into that. Who is to say whether you should or shouldn't be the way that you are? Now, it's true that having bipolar makes life functionally much more challenging. Having depression makes life incredibly challenging. Having anxiety, having these things makes everything more challenging. But that goes back to the things I said before. Who's to say that your life experience is not meant to be those challenges, so you can learn from those things? If we take a drug, I don't want to get into a particular individual that I know, but it's like they literally took these drugs, and they're like horrible things are happening in their life, and you're like, well, how are you feeling about that? Oh, I'm fine. Of course you're fine, because you've biochemically been ordered your computer to, even if someone comes up and stabs you, I'm fine. So these are sort of, these are complicated discussions that most people don't think about with this, and most of us are very vulnerable when we're going through, these things. So of course we get so desperate, we will take the drug, we will take whatever it is, because we just don't want to be suffering anymore. So it's kind of like, and I know that most people who work in that field, I'm sure they honestly believe they're helping people, but it all depends, I guess. Everything comes back. I tell people on why we're here and what we're trying to do. I say again, if your purpose is just to get through this as functionally, optimally as possible, then maybe that's the right path. But I know that's not the case, so then I have a problem with that, because as much as possible you need to be you, and the more pharmacology you take, there's a possibility that then you're not even thinking the same way. How can you even make valid assessments? But I'm not for or dead against anything. Again, we have to be balanced. I'm just presenting a different point of view on that. Okay, so if we're not gonna, so how do we tackle these things, given that we don't have really the science to plug ourselves in and really see what's going on, and there's pros and cons of different methods. So my experience of this is that there is, because we don't know enough, what we have to do, and I did for myself, is you have to just, as much as possible, optimize your balance and your health. So what does that mean? So I will go into this in the channel. So it means altering your diet as much as possible to avoid chemical exposure, substance exposure that we call trigger substances for you. It means that you got to be breathing clean air. Most of us are living in cities, so that's going to be a problem. I know for myself, where I was living in a city, that it was absolutely obvious to me that my condition got worse when pollution was bad, and I would say this to the doctors, my team of doctors, and they're like, oh, I've never heard of that. I'm like, really? You've never heard of that? Because I've got about 50 studies here where scientists have studied this and proven this causality. So, and you get very frustrated the more you know, again, to realize that most so-called experts don't have a clue, because they are only when you're really suffering are you highly motivated to really get answers, and they are more generalists. That they're having to deal with a lot of conditions. So this is why I say you have to ultimately become the expert if you can. And it's difficult for a lot of people because some of it's kind of scientific knowledge, but if you rely on other people, I've honestly never seen much success for all the people I've seen who have mental health or chronic health, physical problems, who rely on other people to help them. But I know it's not easy to figure this stuff out for yourself. It's extraordinarily difficult, actually. But what worked for me isn't necessarily going to work for you, but the process, the thinking process I went through. So what I'm saying in your diet is what we call eliminating problem foods or problem substances. But there is this very strong mind-body. So ultimately what I've seen is, even if you do everything right in terms of what you eat and exercise we'll talk about, exercise is very important, but knowing how to use it as a health tool. If the root of this problem, whatever it is, either so-called mental depression, anxiety, PTSD, negative ideation, we could go through a long list like in the DSM. If it's rooted in something, particularly, I said, in those childhood years, which a lot of people, so for example, fibromyalgia, which is, the medical profession doesn't really have much of a clue. I will give you my view. I had fibromyalgia as well. I literally had about 20 different things, which I will go through in detail at some point, and how I dealt with them. So for me, fibromyalgia is very strongly a mind-body connection, a mind connection to nerves. So your body has a set of nerves all over it. We call it a mesh. Okay, so what I believe happens in fibromyalgia is there's trauma, usually in childhood, but it could be later, a major trauma, emotional trauma, physical trauma, and that we could call it stress, is expressing in sort of random nerve firing or pain in nerves. Now, I could go a lot into some of the science I've discovered about this, and I've shown for myself that we'll talk about something called the HPA, or hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. I've got, it's too much to all put in this video. I'm just trying to give you an overview of things that we'll talk about in this health part of the channel, and I've also got a tremendous amount to say here. So if you're suffering from something like fibromyalgia, what I'm going to say to you is, at very high odds, it's trauma related, emotional trauma related. I've talked to other medical people that work in this, and they have told me privately, like, this very high instance of sexual abuse in childhood or physical abuse or later in life is related. So that seems to connect to this expression in nerves. Now, doctors, when you go say they have fibromyalgia, what they're really saying is, I can't find any measurable physical problem wrong with you, so it must be this thing called fibromyalgia, because you want to know. So doctors got fed up with saying, I don't know, and the patient's getting angry, so they'll say that. It doesn't really help you. Okay, so how are you going to help that? Again, this is an extraordinarily difficult one. Like, fibromyalgia is very, very, very difficult because it is strongly mind-body. So anything that's strongly mind-body, and it could be almost anything physically in the body, and it can be any of those so-called mental health issues. We have to figure out, what happened, where did it originate, and then we have to try to rewire, reprogram. I talk about deprogramming and reprogram that. I don't believe that therapy is good. That can start the process of understanding the root of these emotional traumas or whatever the trauma was, but then it's not very effective actually altering that programming, because the model in psychiatry and psychology, it doesn't have my model of what I'm saying, which you could think of as a computer model, the mind as a biological computer. What I'm saying, and I've said in other videos, is why something like hypnosis might be more effective if you can very specifically identify the incidents, and when we can work to try and desensitize that. In my own experience, and I have a lot of experience, but I don't want to go into all in this video. My wife had some severe mental health issues, which I don't know if I'll get her on here because she's very resistant to it. But so we've been together 35, 36 years. So I have experience of, she had almost died from anorexia when she was a teenager, and then she had what therapists believe was severe bipolar, but they were wrong, and I explain why I don't blame them for that, but it's an easy misdiagnosis. He actually ends up having something called BPD, or borderline personality disorder. So I know a tremendous amount about that disorder, and just going through that experience journey with her and trying to help her, which I failed to do for a very long time because I had to change my mindset to learn the things that I'm trying to impart to you about mental health. Now, one of the biggest things that I overall have learned, I mentioned in another video, I call the line in the Arctic problem, which is that I'm saying there isn't necessarily anything, air quotes, wrong with people who have chronic health problems like I did that even nearly killed me, or mental health issues. What do you mean there's nothing wrong with me? Yes, I mean, it makes your life, as I say, tremendously difficult. What you have to understand is that nature, in this sense you could say our genes, want to create infinite diversity in everything. So for example, having ADHD, I have ADHD. Is that something that's wrong with you, or is that just genetic diversity? My point is, it's very hard to delineate, as we say in sense, or I say, whether that is something that you shouldn't have. Who decides that? Yes, it makes things more difficult and more challenging. No one is disputing that. But does that mean we should try to eliminate it? Because there's usually a cost to eliminating that, or a risk. So again, I talk about balance not being this simple seesaw, two-dimensional. It's at least three-dimensional. There's no simple answer to these things. We'll have to dig down a rabbit hole to discuss things like that, but I just want to put it out there that I think it helped me to stop saying to myself that there's something wrong with me, because if you say something wrong with you, then you start a blame game of why did this happen to me? Why is this wrong with me? This is so unfair. This is what anyone that has any severe mental health or physical health problems, is so unfair. Life is so much harder. Like, believe me, the best version of myself found life a piece of cake, and I reached the top of my profession, consulting in advanced computer science. And at my worst, with these health problems, I literally couldn't remember my own name, and I could barely get out of bed for years. So I've experienced both sides of that. To have this, as I would say, I needed to have this journey to have that contrast. We'll talk about the fact that our minds and our learning journey is mostly, we only learn through experience, but also contrast of experience. We understand hot because we've experienced cold. We understand up because we've gone down. That's another big discussion, but trying to keep my mind, which I find difficult, on this particular linear discussion about mental health. Yeah, I think it helped me to not perceive that there's something wrong with me, and say, actually, this is exactly who I'm meant to be. It's just, what I realized is that in my particular case, all my chronic health problems, which got unbelievably bad, are a direct result of how I think, how my mind interacts with this particular, we could call it, reality right now. So, for example, as I said, I think if you have very high empathy, it's very likely that you are going to develop either physical chronic health problems or some kind of mental health problems, because the environment, we all interacting with their environment. I explained that line in the Arctic problem. If you didn't hear the line in the Arctic problem, let me briefly say it. You're a lion, you love Africa, you love warm, you love the space. I then move you into the Arctic, an Arctic enclosure where there's no other lions and just penguins, and you feel absolutely miserable, and you develop depression and anxiety, and you're unhappy, and you've developed chronic pain because you don't like the cold, and you're complaining about it, and all the penguins are pointing and saying, I don't get why are you always complaining? It's great here. Penguins love it, right? Because they're adapted to the environment. So high empathy, I believe, in my experience, and talk to people, it very commonly leads to a whole host of tremendous problems, and probably high suicide rate, all of these things. But it doesn't have to be such directly obvious suicide. In my view, it's also high risk taking behaviors that lead to early death or death. But even if you manage to get past that, it can be physical or emotional, so-called mental health problems. So that's because it's fit to environment. This is what's going on. Now, if we change the environment, if we lived in a world where everyone was high empathy, and I talk about these vibrations, but I won't get into that in this particular video, then you would fit the environment better, and other people who are less empathetic would struggle and develop these problems. But we live in a world that has been, you could say, randomly evolved to be, and I will explain these other videos, but it's not really the case that what I call the power has influenced the environment to their own purposes, which is to make it, they want to de-elevate or lower people's sensitivity and empathy because that's troublesome, because you want to change things to be more fair and less injustice and more fairness and more equality, and these are things that they can't accept. They will bargain and give us a little bit, but they can't really do that because the whole system relies on the fact that, for example, 5 people in the world own 99.9% of the wealth, right? So I mean, and I've explained about the filter event. If you listen to that, and I'll talk more about it. Ultimately, that's what's going to screw us all, because ultimately the high empathy people are trying to move us towards the truth, which is that we have to get everybody to their full potential, and we can't get everybody to their full potential when 90% of the planet are living in absolute poverty, or under unfair conditions and whatever. So I mean, that's a long discussion which we will have, and this isn't to say that I support people who with programming will have a reactive response of you're a socialist Marxist. No, absolutely not. I actually spent most of my time in college arguing against these people because they don't understand human nature, and obviously those systems don't work because they don't recognize human nature and the things that I'm talking about in these other videos. So no, that is not the case. I have tried to be as objective as possible about all these things, but to explain a better system to you, we have to understand a lot of things. But ultimately, where we need to get to up that mountain is that everybody's full potential needs to be expressed, and we are absolutely nowhere near that. And the power of preventing that, as I said, by creating a system that kind of forces people into identities based around this cultural program and the system. Anyway, but this does relate to mental health, because this is where I call it friction. There's a friction between we could call your higher self, real you that came into this body, and what it wants to express to its full potential, and trying to fit to this environment, the line, the Arctic program, trying to fit to your environment. And I believe for myself, once I figured that out, it was amazing. Literally after that point, at least half of all my health issues went away with that realization. So reaching an acceptance that, okay, I call it the price of doing business. For people with high empathy, you're going to have to accept that you're going to have a lot of friction given you're a lion in the Arctic. And just these little things, these little changes of mindset. Now, I've got a lot of practical things to say, particularly through experience with my wife, between us, that figuring out things that help. There's a lot of practical things that can really help you in the day-to-day, hour-to-hour with mental health issues. So this is where things like exercise. I know no one wants to hear it because a lot of people can't find the motivation to exercise. But I'm still working with my daughter. She's unfortunately inherited a few of my health problems, and I'm still working on her with this. That you have to reach a point that's so bad almost that you're willing to do anything. And if you don't like exercise, okay, I realize I have to do this. Exercise is one of the best tools we have of dealing with chronic health and mental health issues. But to do it, you have to it's the most difficult part of that is the very first step to do something. It's getting that motivation. It's like, I don't have any motivation, and I've already said there's no such thing as willpower. That's an illusion. So how do we, people say you got to fake it till you make it. There's some truth to that, kind of, but there's practical things which I have learned that I want to explain to you what helps. Okay, so, and those things are very detailed, which we'll put in separate videos. I'll give you one example. For example, if you know you've got to exercise, you've got to think about it the day before, because what will happen is you'll wake up, and then your mind will be in what I call an altered state, and you won't have that motivation. So you've got to sort of prepare yourself the day before. I think of it, you get up and you put your clothes on. So one of the techniques that I learned for myself, and I've told other people it's helped them, is putting on your mental clothes, is to program yourself that when you wake up, I'm going to, however, no matter how I feel. So every day I wake up, and I usually feel quite depressed, anxious, because this is how my brain chemistry gets messed up when I'm asleep. I wake up and I make myself sit up, and I become aware of that. So I observe myself, and I train myself to become aware of that, and not just get up and go into the day with that mindset. So I put on my new mental clothes, the mindset I want to have, a positive mindset of what I want to achieve, some goals for the day. And again, these are just words, talking the talk. It's the action of doing it. No one can just do that. Like, you've got to keep at it. I talk about emergent properties. Okay, so maybe you can't succeed. I even forget to do this when I first started, but eventually, if you keep at it, that emergent ability, you will learn it. You can't expect to just do these things just like that. You have to put the work in. I'm always saying you have to put the work in. Nobody can easily. It's doing the work that is this life journey, that is this experiential journey, that ultimately at a higher self level, this is what we're here to do. So that's one example, and there's lots of other ones. Like, so for example, to do exercise, sometimes you have to kind of play this mental game of putting on, you have to get some exercise clothes that you exercise in and put those clothes on, and that's kind of almost a hypnotic thing. For me, I take exercise drinks. I will explain to you all the substances. I experimented with like 500 different what we call nutrients, you could say, or substances that could help me. Most of them did not, but I found a lot of things that do help me. So that's another way I trick myself. I take exercise drink, and I put my clothes on, and I've also planned what I'm going to do. All of these things. If you just try to rely on your motivation, your willpower, you'll be screwed. It won't work, because it only works when you're feeling good and you're feeling motivated. But when you have any physical or unbalancedness here, you won't do those things. None of this is going to matter. As I tell my kids, been through this, and other people are trying to help, if you don't do the basics. So I'm sure you've been told this if you're in therapy or you talk to anyone. Your mom would have told you. Moms are very wise, generally speaking. So if you don't get enough sleep, and you don't eat enough or healthily, it's not going to matter, right? Because if you don't sleep enough, you just automatically are unbalanced, and you won't be able to do all these things. You just become. I've got a lot to say and all that, but this video is going to get too long. What I see around me in our society, the system, the environment is just resonating people into just totally unbalanced, and then they're relying on caffeine or other drugs or overwork or over exercise, and these ways of trying to express this energy, because they're just, what we're looking for is not to be over-exercising, not to be overworking, not to be relying on all these stimulants, not to be overstimulated and type A running around supposedly achieving things. You know, what are you actually achieving? The objective is to have the life experience that you came here to have. As I said, this is at the root of it, and the more we get away from that, we're going to eventually pay the price. This is what I see in myself and everyone else that I've ever seen in my life. So I'm going to stop this one here. This is really, there is actually an absolutely massive amount to talk about in this area. So I think this will be like a separate part of the channel. A lot of it's very practical stuff, I have to say, and some of it's more like this, just chiseling away, as I like to say, on our rocks. Okay, but I just hang in there if you know have severe depression, anxiety, all these things. I honestly believe and hope that some of the things I say can really help you, because I've seen them help lots of people that I've talked to. But I'm not going to say it's easy. Obviously, it's easier to take a drug if that works, and that might be something you need to do. And certainly don't stop taking those things if you're on them or going to a therapist. You need to keep doing that. But longer term, I believe this is what we all need to work on. So you can do both things. Let's not get trapped in this binary thinking. Okay, I have to stop myself. Okay, take care, everyone.